Welcome to Ufahamu Africa, a podcast about life and politics on the African continent. I'm Kimmy Dion, one of your hosts, and I'm here with my co-host, Rachel Beatty-Riedel. Hi, Rachel.
Hi, Kim, and hello, listeners. We have a great episode this week and a conversation that I think is really special. Really looking forward to everyone having a chance to hear it. Our group of Mandela Washington Fellows who are at Cornell this summer in the Brooks School of Public Policy and the Einaudi Center for International Studies are having a really fascinating conversation around public policy and governance. And we dig into some really deep questions about inequality and how governance and government policy can or cannot address those questions with some interesting parallels to the United States as well. So I hope everyone enjoys that conversation. Kim, do you have some current events you'd like to bring us up to speed on?
Yes, as I believe you mentioned in a news wrap a couple of weeks ago, we've got a runoff election happening in Liberia this coming week, right? This is where incumbent President George Weah is going to be facing off against Joseph Boakai. It may be a close election, so we'll be watching it closely, of course. What we want to point our listeners to, though, is an excellent essay by Robtel Paley, who, as some of our longtime listeners will recall, was a guest on our show in episode 115 when she talked about her book, her award-winning book about kind of thinking about diasporas and citizenship and what all of that means, with a focus in particular on Liberia and Liberians in the diaspora. Now, this essay that I think our listeners will learn a lot from was published in African Arguments, and it's titled, "Could Joseph Boakai Do a Biden in Liberia's Runoff Election?" Now, in this essay, she compares the elder statesman and runoff presidential candidate Joseph Boakai to U.S. President Joe Biden, because at 78 years old, Boakai is a veteran she calls bridesmaid of Liberian politics. Like his American counterpart, he is running against a populist megastar with what she calls a comical grasp of governance. Now, both Boakai and Biden have had decades-long careers in government. Both of them served as actually overlapping terms as vice presidents for these really kind of these presidential titans, right? So Boakai was the vice president for 12 years to Ellen Johnson Sirleaf. Everyone will recall this is, Liberia's first woman elected president, Africa's first woman elected president, while Joe Biden, of course, served for 2 terms, 8 years under President Barack Obama, the first Black president elected in the United States. So, that's not where their likenesses end, right? There's a lot of, kind of, again, the real kind of elder statesmen, will bring gravitas to government when a lot of people are, looking at George Weah, a former footballer who ran on a populist campaign and continues to use populist rhetoric in his current campaign for re-election, which, he didn't win in the first round. And some of that is, if you look at, for example, Afrobarometer data that was collected in the most recent round of Afrobarometer data collected from Liberia, there's not a lot of trust in the president. There's not a lot of trust in the ruling party. There's also not a lot of trust in the National Electoral Commission. And so we'll see what that means in this runoff race, and if Weah will be able to hold on to his post in government, or if Boakai at age 78 would begin a very long presidential term.
Such an important, interesting, and really critical election that we will be continuing to watch. The other election that I just wanted to turn to, also really a kind of, contested moment, is that which will be coming up in Madagascar on November 16th. So there have been many growing demonstrations, protests. The country is really fraught at this moment about the 2 main candidates. President Rajoelina is seeking a 3rd term, which, however, is constitutionally valid or allowed because of a break in his clock in 2013, 2014. So what is happening right now is that if you remember or were following Madagascar's politics, Rajoelina himself came to power via a military coup. that toppled elected President Marc Ravalomanana in 2009. So those two candidates then, by the 2013 polls, continued to kind of be in this contestation over who was the legitimate president, with their various bases and supporters really squaring off around who had legitimate right to rule. The Southern African Development Community, SADC, stepped in amongst all of this tension and encouraged or pressured both of them to not run in the 2013 polls, at which time another president was elected. And then Rajoelina returned to win the 2018 elections. So if then he wins this coming November, he will hold office for 14 years. Now, the polls have already been very contested, and there have been several controversies over which Rajoelina has typically kind of gone the extra institutional or not totally democratic, institutionally legal route. Last month, the Constitutional Court dismissed an attempt to disqualify Rajoelina himself from the presidency after it was revealed that he had held dual citizenship, both Malagasy and French citizenship, which appeared to violate the law. And Rajoelina said that he had to obtain French citizenship because in 2014, he had been ruled out of politics and he needed French nationality as a kind of backup. So there are all of these controversies over whether or not he's a legitimate candidate, having come to power in the first place via a coup, his citizenship, and then all of the objections to him and his kind of followers and entourage. So the 10 opposition candidates have come together in a kind of coalition and a collection of election with both the former president and 10 other opposition candidates. And this then they've been boycotting the election campaign. So again, we're kind of moving out of the normal channels of election campaign and competition and into these extra institutional strategies of boycott. The collection of 11 opposition were not authorized to protest, and so they engaged in an unauthorized protest march against what they see as Rajoelina's biased handling of the elections themselves. And then the government responded with a kind of military police retaliation, tear gas, and arbitrary arrests. So an incredibly contested election coming up in Madagascar, and here too we'll keep everyone posted. But the stakes, I think, for Madagascar are quite high in terms of this kind of ongoing question about what are the routes through which candidates become legitimate and are able to support, to campaign and gain supporters.
Sorry, I'm still stuck on the fact that like he needed French citizenship as a backup. Like bro, yeah. Like that's a really like what a thing to say. Like exactly. And I'm sorry, you're running for president? Like how does that, how is I mean, that's a lot. So just talking about like, you know, I don't know. I mean, obviously very serious. There's an election about to happen in Madagascar, but also it just reads as like there's lots of elements there that are odd. And I just want to talk about some other, I don't know, another odd thing was reported. So Foreign Policy has a weekly newsletter called Africa Brief that we love and we subscribe to, and we learn a lot from, but also it's so varied in its content. And for example, in a recent issue of Africa Brief, there was a jailbreak in Guinea. And it reads like an HBO miniseries, kind of like in the making. Now 60 soldiers and prison officers have been fired after this jailbreak. And the jailbreak is not just like, oh, like letting a few prisoners go. It was former president and junta leader Musa Dadis Camara, right? So people may recall, right? Camara led a 2008 military coup, right? So just talking about like Rajoelina, military coup, right? Camara led a 2008 military coup and ruled Guinea for almost a year. until a 2009 assassination attempt, right? Which is itself like that whole saga of like the short period of rule, the assassination attempt, and he nearly died. So it wasn't just like, someone shot at him from far away and it missed him. Like, no, he was actually, it had really affected him. And he's been on trial since September 2022, accused of being responsible for the stadium massacre that happened in Guinea in 2009, when at least 150 people were killed. And there was significant sexual violence as well, at this, in this stadium, which had been a pro-democracy rally, right? So Guinea at that time, right, in 2008, 2009, was really kind of struggling with trying to become more democratic, right? Certainly the wishes of many Guineans, but not, of course, the military coup leader, Dadis Camara. So it was a jailbreak of him and two others, and at least 9 people were killed in a shootout after, quote, heavily armed commandos stormed into the jail in Guinea's capital, Conakry. And so Kamara was only freed for a few hours. He was recaptured and returned to prison a few hours after he had broken out. But again, it's giving like HBO drama. It's fascinating. I wouldn't believe that it was real, except that it was published in Foreign Policy's Africa Brief, and so I know they're not making things up.
Exactly. Now those some of the jailbreak assist men, let's say, are now before the court, right? In terms of their role. So yeah, that's an interesting story as well. Kim, I know sometimes we like to keep our listeners informed on new research and articles that have come out that pertain to life and politics. And so one of the new articles that I just wanted to draw our listeners' attention to is in the conversation. The title is about Kenya. It's called Kenya's Courts Were Under Political Pressure, How a Constitutional Reform Empowered Judges, and by Talia Gurso, who's a postdoctoral fellow at the London School of Economics. And what I loved about this article is that it talks about how Kenya's constitutional reforms in 2010 set out a new kind of room for maneuver for the independence of the judiciary, and created room then for the judges to act as guardians of democracy and of the electoral process. And what's, I think, really striking about this work is that Kim and I have talked many times on the podcast about Malawi and Kenya and the ways in which places and times in which courts either act as guardians of democracy and either by making rulings around third terms or allowing particular candidates to compete or disqualifying particular candidates to compete. And they play this super critical role around the electoral process. And so what I love about Talia's work, and this article in particular, which kind of traces the process by which this happened in Kenya, is that it reminds us that courts themselves can have this dual role. They can be pro-democratic in really key instances. They can also be agents of autocratization and support executives who are centralizing power and undergoing kind of moves towards more authoritarianism. And what helps us to think about that, their changing role, it's not that courts always play a static role, right? That changes in things like the Constitution or other institutional domains about how courts and other judges are appointed, what the process is through the legislature, by the executive, et cetera, that institutional changes in other domains affect the courts and can have an impact, therefore, across these kind of multiple channels, and can create conditions in which the judiciary can play a more activist role in supporting democracy. And in particular, that can have real support from the people, from the electoral base, that judges can, in the Malawi case, at least I'm learning from Kim and Boniface Dulani, that the ability of the citizens to go out and protest can sometimes really give the judges that mandate, that popular mandate. And in the Kenyan case, then they had the institutional mandate to have more independence and authority.
Yeah, and I'll just also point our listeners to Mishak Samati's work. So he's a political scientist at Cal State San Marcos, and he wrote a book that came out 3 years ago, I think, about and his was examining post-election violence in Africa, looking at the important role that judicial independence plays. So there really is, you couldn't have convinced me in graduate school, right, that like courts mattered. I don't know. But Mishak Samati changed my mind, right? That even if, I didn't care about reading legal briefs or cases or any of that stuff, that just the independence of the court really matters. And Peter von Dopp's work shows us this in Southern Africa. That courts can be an effective check on executive power. But Mishak's work too, I think, kind of building on what you're talking about, Rachel, his work shows us that it's not just about that check on power, but actually can mean the difference between, the independence of the court can lead election losers to seek redress in the courts. Because if they believe the courts to be independent and there's an actual chance for them to correct a wrong, they'll go to the courts. But if the courts are just puppets of the presidents, then they just take to violence. And so there's a lot of important roles that as I'm getting older, I'm realizing, institutions are important, and how we invest in them, especially if we want there to be peace, stability, and democracy, right? That there's not a lot that can replace good old-fashioned political institutions where people can work out their differences in a way that doesn't involve violence, right?
Totally. And if we look at, the case we were just talking about, Madagascar, the way in which the opposition has taken to the streets, right? There's clearly a kind of lack of trust in the electoral process, in the institutional process, and in the courts around who is a candidate and who is not, and what kinds of protections that offers. I think that's exactly right. It's in each of the kind of news stories that we were just discussing. So
Indeed.
So with that, we will take a listen to a set of experts who are talking about public policy, governance, and the role of these institutional levers, and how they can or cannot be utilized to address social inequality and well-being. So our guests here today, I'm going to just introduce them briefly to you, to our listeners, and then have them tell you a little bit about themselves, about their journeys, about their current work and expertise, and how they came to this really critical work that they're doing. So our first guest is Sandile Mnikati from South Africa, and he is a deputy mayor focusing on infrastructure and community engagement. Welcome, Sandile.
Thanks for having me, and greetings to your listeners as well.
So, Sandile, tell us a little bit about your journey and how you came to your current position and what kind of public policy work you do.
Sure. So, as you correctly pointed out, I'm the Deputy Mayor of Umgeni Municipality, which is a municipality in South Africa in the province of KwaZulu-Natal. I was elected in that council when I was 22 through what is known as a by-election, and I won that seat for my party. And I've been in that space up until recently, the elections in 2021. So South Africa has two types of elections. We have local government elections where we elect our council and our mayors. And then we have our province and national elections where we elect our president and premiers. And so for the very first time, the party that I belong to won its very first municipality in KwaZulu-Natal. We won it off the ruling party, the African National Congress. And so we then took the seat of governance, and that's how I became the deputy mayor. So I also represent a constituency. So my constituency is known as the KwaZulu-Natal Midlands. And so, I'm the chairperson of the infrastructure as well as community services. So infrastructure deals with your roads, electricity provision, reticulation. We also deal with building a lot of facilities. So due to a legacy of apartheid, a lot of the township areas where our previously disadvantaged folk come from don't have this type of infrastructure. And so it's my duty or my department's duty to ensure that we build that infrastructure and that people have access to that infrastructure. And then, of course, also with community services. So community services deals a lot with disaster management. That's a critical focus point of ours, as well as parks and gardens. And a lot of people don't necessarily think parks and gardens are important, but they are important because we need to have people that lead healthy lifestyles, and we need to be able to give them that space. And so I deal with that. And cemeteries. And so, a lot of times when you talk about local government, people don't understand how important cemeteries are. If you come from an African context, you can see how important cemeteries are because African people want to go back to their loved ones and, perform various rituals and ceremonies. And so it's a really important part of the work that I do. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, unlike America, where you guys have a police department, we've got a police department, which is SAPS, but we also have a traffic department. And the traffic department is administered by local government. And so I'm also in charge of that. So that's currently the space that I'm in at the moment in the work that I'm doing.
Great. We're so glad to have you with us, Sandile. Our next guest is Lindah Mbaisi, who's from Kenya. And Lindah is a communications professional who works with Kenyan farmers to tell their stories and thinks about how to communicate around public policy to farmers and with farmers. She's interested in joining the Ministry of Agriculture or Environment. And here at Cornell, it's really a great pleasure to have her, in particular because of our connection to agriculture and extension work. So Lindah, welcome. Tell us a little bit about yourself and your expertise and your pathway.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for having me. So, yes, you said everything. My name is Lindah from Kenya, and I am a communication specialist with 12 years of experience. I just transitioned into agriculture. Actually, it's been 2 years so far, and I really enjoy working with farmers, communities in the rural settings, and working with government and donors and development partners to just support our farmers to see the advantages in their farming enterprises. So I am currently the communications manager at Cereal Growers Association. It's a member-based organization with currently 200,000 members. Basically, just my role entails advocacy, policy issues, documenting their impact stories and their change stories to encourage social, political, and even behavior change generally. Yeah.
Wonderful, Lindah. Thank you so much for being with us. And our third guest is Eunice Chapange from Namibia. And Eunice is fascinated by geography and the built environment and was in the Navy for several years. Now working with GIA, a German organization in community development and community participation, Eunice is particularly interested in learning about nonprofits and community organizations and how they navigate legislative barriers to effective change. So Eunice, welcome and tell us a little bit about your journey.
Thank you very much for having me. And hello to the listeners. As you rightfully put it, that's basically me in a nutshell. But just to add a little bit, basically I am an urban planner by profession. I'm in training. And what inspired me to basically just sort of get into the whole nonprofit or international development cooperation was basically that gap that I experienced with especially community participation in decision making when it comes to issues that basically affect their lives. And I've been involved in a project that deals with informal settlement upgrading and provision of tenure security to people that have had a history of being basically evacuated, moved from their lands. Yes, I just want to, or rather it pushed me into the direction of advocacy and policy change in an attempt to just help them have a voice in decision making, and also just to have them question the decisions that the policymakers and those in power are making, and for them to also just have an opportunity to influence the outcome of legislative and regulatory frameworks.
Excellent, Eunice. Thank you so much. Yeah, we'll have much to talk about today on the planning side of things. So our fourth and final guest, last but not least, is Sandile Lencoasa from South Africa. So Tidi is interested in policy advocacy and helping her country address the electricity supply. We've actually had quite a few episodes on the pod about electricity in South Africa by some of our non-resident fellows. So this will be a great way to continue that conversation. And she also is working on national level budget strategies. So around how South Africa handles their budget, prioritizes the budget, particularly in light of climate change. And that revolves around not only electricity and power supply, but also in terms of healthcare and education. So Ntidi, tell us a little bit about your background and how you came to this work.
Yeah, thanks, Rachel. Thanks for having us. So I was born in 1994, and in South Africa, that's the year that we had our first elections. So we're referred to as the born-free generation, and particularly, I was actually born in the middle of a protest. So the hospital that I was born at, they downed tools and stuff. And I just feel like that, since then, I've just really been about policy and particularly healthcare and education, because just growing through, I've grown with my country. So we're the same age as a country. And we've just seen, I've just seen how, as a country we've grown, and some of the things that have worked well and some of the things that can work better. And one of the things that, the overriding themes of South Africa is that legacy of apartheid, which is inequality. And that apartheid system was about entrenching inequality, and it was literally about inequality. And so our biggest challenge, I think, is redressing that and making sure that we have more equitable access to things like education and healthcare. I'm particularly passionate about that because of that lived experience, using public healthcare infrastructure, health systems, but also policy interventions that have worked for me, be it through education interventions that made sure that I became a first generation graduate, interventions like this fellowship that meant that I was able to get out of my context to, learn what's happening in America, and other parts of the world. And so I'm just really interested in how we can allocate funding specifically, to ensure that as many people as possible get access, education, healthcare, that kind of access, and also to solve some of the problems. And I think you mentioned, just to round up, that you mentioned my interest in the electricity crisis in South Africa. I think all South Africans are very interested in that because it's just really so pervasive. But my area of interest is just making sure that hospitals and schools continue to run in that way and they're not disadvantaged, and the issues of the energy crisis today are not borne by the future generation. So that's been my interest. Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, here we return to the question of intergenerational justice, right? How the next generation bears costs of what we do today in public policy and planning, right? So I'm going to veer a little bit away from script and any, questions I may have, shared with you in advance, because today in the United States is a day where the Supreme Court has just ruled on a question affecting major inequality in higher education. The Supreme Court handed down their decision today that disallows the policies of affirmative action in higher education admissions in the United States. And here, two of our guests from South Africa have just spoken about how they got into the work that they do, in part because of legacies and histories of racial inequality. And that really harkens to this topic in the U.S. as well. We all grapple with legacies of inequality in different ways across different contexts, right? To Namibia as well. And so I wanted to just share with you a quote from the dissenting opinion today of Justice Sotomayor, who wrote, quote, "The devastating impact of this decision cannot be overstated. The majority's vision of race neutrality here in higher education admissions will entrench racial segregation in higher education because racial inequality will persist so long as it is ignored. And I think this is so powerful for our conversation today because public policy has to redress, past wrongs. Otherwise, those inequalities of the past only accumulate, right? Power begets power, resources beget resources. And the work that you all are doing, the four of you, in different ways, uses the power of communications and public policy to try to address inequalities, injustices, and provide for better futures in infrastructure, in public service, in education, and in health, right? And in agricultural output and the like. So I'm wondering if you have any kind of reflections on this quote and the use of public policy and planning and communications around public policy as a tool, as a lever. How do you see it advancing the cause of addressing these inequalities? And how do you use that in your day-to-day lives?
So again, I think when it comes to maybe starting with like affirmative action, I think maybe it's good to like point out again like personal experience for me, because of apartheid, like there were laws in place. It meant that there are like, we require specific interventions or else, we don't, like people like me don't really stand a chance. So I think we all would, I think I speak for like everyone, we'd all love to live in a world where like race doesn't matter. Like I can get into university or whatever it is based on the quality of my work, but not, not being judged based on race. However, unfortunately, like that's not the reality that we live in. And it's just really important to create policies that are context driven and understand like the needs of different people and to realize that we're not all starting at the same on the same like level. And so I worry, I still have to read more about the judgment, but I think I do worry that besides race, so race is like one aspect of it, but what does it mean for inclusivity and like how America will and American universities approach inclusivity and like inclusive policies? So that's something that's on my mind, but I'm more of an advocate. And I think maybe because of the context that I'm from in South Africa, we're a little bit more open about things like race and gender. So even with budgeting, so like fiscal policy. So I'm a fiscal policy analyst, advocate, and advisor. And we largely, I largely advocate for policies that are gender responsive, climate responsive, that specifically look at, like, for instance, with the climate crisis, yes, everyone will bear the burden of the climate crisis, but there are certain groups that are disproportionately affected. And it just, allocating resources to making sure that even in the hardest moments, like they're protected from it. So I'm an advocate of it. I'm open to hearing, and that's why, I came to the US to kind of understand the thought process behind some of those things. But it is, initially it seems like quite disappointing in terms of like inclusive spaces, but yeah.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for just weighing in on that and thinking about how the context, of course, varies, and yet the ways in which we address it and the questions of inclusivity and moving towards greater opportunity and equality of resources is so critical. Anyone else want to comment or share your thoughts?
Yeah, no, I think I definitely agree with TD. And I thought, coming to America, I thought you guys would be far more advanced in terms of the race question. We're still grappling with decolonization of tertiary education. That's still the basics. So I do believe that you sort of have to have these interventions in place to undo the injustices of the past. And I look at our country in particular, and whether, contrary to popular opinion, there's not a single party in South African National Assembly that disagrees, and I'm going back to the land question now, that disagrees that there should be some form of land redistribution or restitution. The only thing we disagree on is the method. And so we also have an appreciation of, as I said, trying to undo the injustices of the past, but we also have to recognize that race still does plays a huge factor now. You go to a public hospital, and I've seen it. You go to a public hospital and you get a white doctor attend you. You feel as though, you're going to get better. But a black doctor comes and you start having doubts. We've seen it with pilots. As soon as a black voice comes over, and South Africa can have a distinctive accent, so we know when someone's black in South Africa. And you hear the pilot speaking, you sort of judging or not entirely sure whether you're going to be safe throughout the entire trip. And so to pretend as though race does not exist and to pretend as though race does not form opinions, I think we would be telling ourselves a lie. I often joke with my friends and I say, you guys have what I don't have. And I call it, I say their white skin is a form of social capital that I don't have. So I say, you must, it's a joke, but there's some truth to it. And I say, no, why don't you complain about the food? Because you'll be taken more seriously than if I complain about the food. So I often joke about it, but it's true, so yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Lindah or Eunice, how do you know, kind of coming from Kenya and Namibia, how do you think this question relates in your context?
So for me in Kenya, it's really not a race issue because majority of the population really is Africans and Black people. But the challenges that we are dealing with are inequalities in terms of the rich and the poor, and really access to really crucial services like health care, education, access to land, and just basically access to even government services. If you're not rich and you can't afford or buy your way into even getting a passport, getting important documents, it's all about your status in the society. So for us, it's about the gap between the rich and the poor is really getting wider by the day. And I just envision Kenya that is equal in terms of looking at the citizens as equal people and equal stakeholders and shareholders to what the country can provide.
In Namibia, we basically share a similar history and legacy with South Africa. And today, again, most of our challenges, although there has been policies in place to try and redress these past injustices, the problem really for us, or the challenge rather, is the perception of the mind. That seem to be dragging us or keeping us in the past. Yes, the issue of race is there. Still, even segregation is very evident in my country in terms of how we are still planning our cities. You can see that huge difference if you go to Windhoek, the capital city. Allocation of resources and services, it's based on that, to say majority of the Black people living in what we call locations that is downtown here do not somehow deserve to be included in these services that are available. And included in the decisions about policies and regulatory frameworks. And so it's really a challenge to try and convince the people who are voting that we can actually make a change. We can try and push for difference, because there's this belief that you need to be affiliated to a certain ruling party to have the advantages, or at least to have a better life. And so everybody seems to sit back and say, I cannot get involved because I am also relying on the small that I've had to struggle to get. So losing it by speaking out is somewhat seen as taboo, but also very weird, because we tend to have a voice, a freedom of speech on social media, for instance, very, very, very vocal. But the moment you look at, and I think when you talk about even affirmative action, or whenever you talk about civil society, to say let's come together, the unions, let's come together and say something about a certain injustice or irregularity in how policies are being enforced or how people are conducting themselves in public institutions, then everybody steps back. And that's also, I think, it's brought by the fact that majority of the people in my country are public servants, are civil servants. So they work for the government. The private sector seems to be very, very hidden, and there's this dependency on the government. That's why, for me, what I really want to see change is that spark, or rather that encouragement for Ubuntu in a way, so that we are able to change the status quo of what we do not want to continue suffering through. If a collective of people can come together and speak out, or have that strong will to change something by really pushing the policy makers on the edge, I think it can help and it can change.
That's such an interesting point that you make, and one that I've often thought of. And you mentioned the dependency of the private sector on the government. Across the world, there's a continuum, a kind of scale, the degree to which private sector is dependent upon the government, and resources and power, ability to get licenses or, make capital productive is in relationship to your connection to political power in the state. That's one end of the spectrum. And in the United States, for example, I think we're at the other end of the spectrum, where the political power is reliant upon the interests of the private sector, right? And the degree to which the private sector has its say, its ability to fund political campaigns and lobby. And, that's just the nature of how politics is funded and made visible in so many ways. And so I think the space that we're discussing today is a really interesting space, because we're at that intersection that happens differently of how do we make public policy, how do you form public policy? How do you get it passed? And then how do you implement it to these shared ends, right? These visions of what good governance looks like. And so I think that's a really interesting space where we need to be thinking about, how does it actually work in practice? So to that end, I wanted to ask each of you, what is your vision of what a just, humane, productive, healthy governance looks like today and in the future? What do you imagine when you see well-being for humanity, well-being for individuals that could be achieved, implemented by public policy, by governance, by planning, whether it be at the local level where you're involved, the national level, international level? How would you describe that vision? When Eunice just mentioned Ubuntu, so where do we go from here?
So as a communication professional, I have realized that governments, not just in Kenya, there's a gap in terms of how they communicate issues or matters policy to the citizens. The gap keeps growing, maybe because they do not want the citizens to have the information, and there is very little public participation in terms of matters that really are important to them. So a just government for me is where public institutions really put the interests of the people at the center of the work they do. Unfortunately, that's not the case. Every 5 years, Kenya goes to elections, and we put the same leaders in. The people who are appointed to take up these public posts are rewarded. Most of them are not really qualified to do the jobs. And so there's very little public participation, disregard for the rule of law in terms of what they are doing. And so there are those challenges. And the private sector in my country cannot do anything without a nod or a green light from government agencies. So you have to really involve them. You have to follow up with the ministry that is aligned to the work that you do. And therefore, the bureaucracy, the processes, it takes time to even implement a single policy that could have taken a very short time to agree on. And it's a problem in the agriculture sector. Farmers know nothing about issues like climate change, yet they bear the biggest brand of climate change. Most of them are not really literate. They are not really educated. Therefore, they require policy information on climate change to be disseminated to them in very simplified manner, in a very simplified way, so that they understand and they are able to mitigate climate change effects. And so I just look forward to a day where public offices, government will put the interests of the people at the center of their work.
I think I definitely agree with what Linda says. And I think one thing that South Africa did right when informing its local government system is that it had something, I think it might be one of its kind, where we have ward committee members, whereby members of the community can elect someone onto the ward committee. And so what you do there is that you work hand in hand with your elected councillor, the representative, and you bring issues that your community is talking about to the councillor, and the councillor must escalate that to council itself. But also in terms of budgeting and planning, no budget is ever passed in any municipality. It's legislated that the mayor, who is the custodian of the budget, must go to the community and must engage the community. So whatever is found in what is known as the IDP, which is the Integrated Development Plan, our 5-year plan, it has to be something that the community has said that we need. Where the problem comes in is that politicians have failed to act on the IDP, because politicians have then taken a decision to have these nice-to-haves that the community never said that they needed. And so I think, it's important that we go back to the people, and because we also understand that's what democracy says. I also think that to answer your initial question, looking from a local government perspective, and I think the Constitution is quite clear, if as local government, and myself included, if we are failing to do something as basic as refuse collection, then we have failed, and there's no just society. It was shocking to find that there were communities in our municipality that had never received refuse collection whatsoever. So far along in democracy, there we have failed. If there are people, which there are to this day, that are still drinking out of Jojo tanks, which are water tankers that don't have running water, then as local government we have failed. If there are people that are still using pit toilets and not flushing toilets, then we have failed. If there are people that cannot access information. And, information is a massive thing. And all local governments have been asked to have youth officers, because you understand that young people, I was in downtown Ithaca the other day, and I was shocked to find out that you got free Wi-Fi. It's not everywhere in South Africa. In the main city centers, Johannesburg, Pretoria, Durban, you might get that. But you go to some rural village or municipality, it's not there. So I think up until we can deliver basic services to people, then I don't think we can talk about a just society. And our local government, politicians and administrators alike have failed in what they've been elected or there to do.
Yeah.
That's another thing.
No, I think I totally agree and concur with my colleagues here. For me, I just wanted to add that, or rather to say, a just government to me is that everybody has an equal opportunity to thrive, no matter which background you come from, and enabling. I think the politicians, or maybe those who make legislation, they like to say an enabling environment. So everybody needs to have that opportunity to thrive. Everybody needs to have an opportunity to be heard. At the same time, I think our leadership positions need to have some accountability and acknowledgement, because in as much as, like in my country, Sandile was just talking about budget. Yes, the council draws up this budget. They generate it, of course, from service profits. And what happens is that they publish a document with all the numbers, not even having to teach anybody how this worked, how this process has been done, how did they come to the numbers. And they put the books in their office. So when you come to pay for your water, for instance, your water bill, then if you know about it, you can take the budget and possibly go evaluate it. But there's still no platform for you to come and criticize or question how was what allocated to what and so forth. So I think a just government needs to really look at that, all of these issues, and ensure that everybody has an equal opportunity to thrive, to become what they can or what they desire to be.
So well said. Yeah, Sandile, did you want to respond to that?
Not respond, but just add on to what Eunice is saying. Another thing that I think all political parties across the board, what they need to stop doing is this tendency of saying when there's public participation, we hire buses and we fill them up with just our supporters so that they can go there and say things that we like. Because that's defeating the objective of what it is that we're trying to achieve. I've seen it happen when it comes to bills in Parliament, where every single party will rally their supporters and make sure that they're there so that they're the loudest voice. And I've seen it happening in budgeting time as well. Because also, and I can say this because I'm a politician, is that we don't like to be told things that we don't want to hear. And we also want people to like us all the time. So as long as we're continuing with that mindset, then we might as well, we can't say that we're having effective public participation because it's a waste. It's a farce.
Yeah, so true. Tidi.
Yeah. So when I think about like my vision of like a just society, it initially sounds like quite airy-fairy, which is like I have this vision that people like don't live in fear anymore and make decisions based on love and compassion. And I thought initially, I was like, oh no, am I really going to say that on a podcast about policy? It sounds very, like a little bit of a hippie, which I am, but like, and then I looked at South Africa's National Development Plan, which is like our, I guess, almost like our sustainable development goals, or like rooted in that, like what we plan on achieving by 2030. And I must say, like, we're quite far off from this, but they describe like what the vision of a society that we want to have by 2030 is, that people fall asleep without fear, listen to the rain on the rooftops and gather in front of heat. Everyone has a toilet and water, and every community has a school, teachers who love teaching and learning, police station with respected and upright police, nurses, clinics with nurses who are caring and loving towards people. And I think that's honestly the vision that I have. And I think that in terms of policy, generally South Africa, I think what we'd say is like quite well celebrated in terms of like the policy formulation. Yes, we have a way to go. Yes, our policies can be more gender responsive. They can be more inclusive. The public participation, as Sandile mentioned, like could be more like reflective of like actual genuine public participation and not winning political, just like political wins. But I think that that's why I love policy so much, because there's such an opportunity for that. Unfortunately, or why I think we haven't really achieved that just vision of that society that's based in love and not in fear is that our policy implementation has not been what it's supposed to be, and our governance has not been great. And I think big part of it is that, like, so from a fiscal policy perspective, their education and healthcare specifically, or like social development, they get so much funding. The biggest areas of the budget outside of interest on debt, but that's something that we can talk about another time. But generally, South Africa spends a lot of money on education and healthcare, but every year, the quality of spend gets criticized. So every year, each province ends up returning, like there's some provinces like, listeners might not know them, but like a province like Mpumalanga or the Eastern Cape, we've returned like nearly R500 million in funding because they just couldn't spend it. They didn't have the capacity to spend it. And that just means that, for a large part of the country, people are not benefiting from these hard-earned victories post-94. Like, people died for this kind of freedom and this access, but also not benefiting from this, we're not even giving our policies a chance. And so even though initially it might sound like this airy-fairy thing, when you actually look at the barriers to implementation, you realize like, these are the things that are actually stopping, making our society unjust in that way. But yeah.
That's so powerful. It really resonates with something that I've long kind of held as a kind of principle when I think about political science, when I think about politics, and when I think about power. And that is that we all are seeking individual liberty and liberty for our community, for our societies. And that liberty is premised on a certain level of security or order, or in Tidi's terms, like not having to live in fear, right? I can only realize my liberty and your liberty when together we don't live in fear, because that's what gives us true freedom together, right? And that it is actually a communal act to realize that. And the word that I had never associated in that before, but that you just brought into the conversation, is one that's love, right? That part of our liberty is based on our capacity to love, right? And then the flip side of liberty isn't just like, how do we find order through security, but how do we find order in recognizing our shared humanity, right? And a solidarity. So I think that's so powerful, what you've added to the conversation.
Yeah. Thanks so much for that, Rachel. And if I can just add to what you're saying, I think that's so powerful, especially when you talk about like liberty, because, you know, we hear that in the movies in association with American values. I actually hadn't thought about that. And I think maybe why I speak about things like love and compassion is, again, like the whole concept of Ubuntu. And in South Africa, I think there's a little bit of I don't know, it gets more praise, I think, internationally than it does. Like, we do talk about that concept. Like, we say that when we praise someone and say that they have like deep compassion, we say, oh, une libotho or une Ubuntu. But like, we don't like, yeah, it's just a whole different thing. But I think beyond that is like to treat someone like I am because someone else is. That is like how we view like love. And I just think when we have interventional like policies that don't work, when government fails the people, it means that people are living in fear, and so they don't get the opportunity to fully like trust and like love their neighbor and like to do things that they're actually like passionate about. And so we live in fear of like, oh, I don't want to be poor, or I don't want to be a victim of this form of violence, I don't want this. And so people make decisions based on that, and we're missing an opportunity to just, and even like, you know, during pandemic or any like form of crisis, I think we do focus a lot on the negativity, but people don't actually realize that it's actually the goodness of human beings, the interventions of like everyday people that's keeping this society that should have fallen apart a long time ago together. Like in South Africa, you know, during apartheid, there was a huge issue with like access to, you know, early childhood development. And so there were a lot of like grannies in the townships, or you call like the segregated areas for like black people, while the mothers went into town to raise other people's children, the black children didn't have someone to look after them. And so these ladies stepped in and they created like early childhood development centers for free without any support from government, just to make sure that children aren't running around on the streets without protection. And today, like that's how our early childhood development landscape in South Africa is predominantly made of those practitioners, which is different to like other parts of the world. And those kind of interventions just remind me that, yes, we have all these complex terms and we have like economics that will tell you about like scarcity mindset and everything. But when you're dealing with everyday people, it's like the interventions, it's the nurse or the doctor who gave me free healthcare here in America, which is like a story for another day. It's through that kind of compassion and that kind of love that's actually keeping our societies like together.
Exactly. So I want to just take that point that you've just made, because it connects directly to how we see opportunities for public policy and planning and communication out of challenges, right? Sometimes the greatest opportunities we become aware of them because we recognize a challenge that we're facing, like you mentioned, around early childhood care and education. So what do each of you see as the opportunities for our listeners who, like you, are interested in creating a more humane and just governance future? How do you view constraints and places where change can really happen? And what advice do you might have to share for our listeners?
I see a lot of opportunity to influence basically governance in our spaces through ethical conduct. I think it's really high time that we start owning up to our weaknesses as people, as basically to own up to the problems that we create for others. So I see opportunities for us to be the change. We now know how difficult it has been seeing or living in these spaces with challenges. So I think when we are in our spaces, we need to bring that aspect of humility into it, bring that aspect of honesty and accountability. And like they say, actions speak louder than words. So we do need to act and stand on the principles we want others to do or to show us. We also need to be the voices of the voiceless, those who are unable to have opportunities and privileges we have. I think we should take that chance and give them that, put them on the spotlight or give them those spaces for them to say something. And lastly, I think we need to also just create awareness on the power of togetherness. And knowing our rights as voting citizens, especially us who are in democratic systems. I think in as much as we take it for granted, once you know your rights as a citizen, you are able to evoke change. And I speak especially from a Namibian context. Up until I think 3 or 5 years ago, we didn't know there is actually anything that exists in our constitution as an independent candidate. So it was very shocking when one fellow he's a dentist by profession, and he came out and he said, "I am going to run for presidency as an independent candidate." And the lawyers were brought in, the justice system was brought in, and it turns out we can actually do that. So now our local government is actually being governed by these guys, party members, and he just had to run as an independent candidate. And this is something that we didn't know, but it changed the dynamics of politics in the political space in my country. And although, yes, again, I think it comes down to perception, the mind. He has his flaws, the party has its flaws, but I think it was an eye-opener really just to say that knowing your rights as a voting citizen, you have the power to change a lot. And I see all these avenues as opportunities for people or for us as fellows to really go back and just instill all these principles in the spaces we are in.
Absolutely. Thank you, Eunice. Who else would like to come in on that? Yes, Lindah.
Yeah, I think as Mandela Fellows, we are really lucky to have gotten this opportunity to be here at Cornell to just hone our leadership skills. These opportunities are really rare, and I know from the number of applications that the fellowship got, it was really, people really applied, and we should take advantage of this opportunity to just go back to our countries, inspire others to be better leaders. So for the opportunities, I really see technology as a big tool for us to leverage on technology and use our voices. If you cannot speak verbally, just write it down. There's social media. You can do a blog post and people will be reading, not just people from your country, but people from other countries will see your work in championing for involvement of citizens in policy processes, empowerment of people who we consider not very educated, like farmers, like people who are doing jobs that don't really require a lot of education. And so it's important that we leverage on technology to pass our messages and just to use our voices. I mean, our futures are really very unpredictable. We have experienced the COVID pandemic. We have the climate crisis to deal with. So one day at a time, but really using your voice is the most important thing that you can do. there are various opportunities that and various platforms that for us we can use to evaluate our progress in our communities to just see the change that we are making. And I hope that everyone believes in themselves and see themselves as an important piece of the change process.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you for that, Lindah. Sandile, do you have thoughts?
Yeah, I do. I think often, so in South Africa at the moment, it is still Youth Month. So in South Africa at the moment, it's Youth Month. And so we often get invited to speak at these, events, and you asked, what do you want to say to the youth? And I always tell them the same thing. You got to take up your space and be unapologetic about it. And I often get told that I'm a very unorthodox politician, and my response is, well, that's great. We need more people who aren't like politicians holding political office and making decisions, because politicians, in a way, the traditional politicians got us where we are now. But I think from what Tsidi said, I think it's important. She's quite correct in saying that we have some of the best policies and legislation. Implementation is lacking. And I think that is a challenge, but an opportunity, as you said, can arise from a challenge. And I think some of the opportunities that arise from there is that we can introduce consequence management. I don't think that there has been consequence management for a very long time, but we can also introduce performance management. And I think it's high time that we start having some of these outcomes that these policies seek to achieve embedded in some of the targets that we set for administrators, to say, this is a tangible outcome we want from you. If you have not met that, then you failed in this particular one. Capacitate them, of course, because they always complain about capacity. And then once you've capacitated them, then you tell them, hey, these are the targets that you must meet, and we're putting on you in terms now. You fail to meet this, then you're out. And we start to work towards this. So I think that's a huge opportunity for us to actually start introducing the systems. We spent, especially consequence management, we spend lots and lots of money. We had the Zondo Commission and interstate capture. No consequences. So, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And just to ask you about that, are you talking about the bureaucracy, like civil servants being held accountable for delivering once they've been given the resources to carry out the mandate?
Correct, because it's very easy for us. You vote us out. That's that's the power you get. You say you have failed to do this, out you go. But now technocrats, they must be put on terms as well to say, this is a policy that we'd like you to implement by year 5 or whatever the case may be. These are the outcomes. So we build that into their targets. You fail to meet that, then you start to performance manage you out.
Yeah. Which is also another way of thinking about transparency of accountability, because if you have that kind of mandate and consequence, then, there's a lot more interest in the audit of knowing, well, were they given the right resources to be able to do it? And, that creates more transparency all around, because you would have that conversation. Yeah, very interesting. Tidi, what about you?
Yeah, I concur with everything that everyone, the other panelists have said. Those are all really great suggestions. And so maybe I'll approach it from a context of like the climate crisis. And so, the world is experiencing like the climate crisis, but also just in general, like just feels like we're one crisis after the other, from the recession, all of that. And that sounds quite overwhelming and quite scary, and it is, because there are, lives that are lost because of these kind of things. So, justifiably so to be scared. But I also think that just based on, I guess, being South African, being African, when I look at leaders like, Nelson Mandela, leaders like Chris Hani, leaders like Lillian Ngoyi, I start to remember or reflect that actually it is during moments of crisis, there's actually opportunity in it. And specifically, there's like an opportunity for for young people to shape the world the way that they want to. If we can see these things as like loopholes or potholes, and we can be like, oh, this should be better, that should be better. When you look at like history that has been made, yes, there is a ruling class of people who have certain things, but, people like Nelson Mandela is just another, he was just like us at our age, probably even worse. Definitely worse because of like the context. It was literally apartheid, and, other leaders, Kwame Nkrumah, like all of them have the same thing. They were all also once young leaders. And so I agree, especially with what Sandile is saying, is just to step up and take space and recognize that we're responsible for creating the world that we actually envision. Like if we have a vision for the world, like it's up to us. And I think also with this crisis, yes, consequence management, I think that's a really powerful one. Capacity building, and also using like the resources that we do have. So I know like for South Africa is a middle income country, and I would say we definitely have the resources. We have the budget, yes. GDP growth is not where it should be, but we spend a lot of money. Like we actually do have the resources, the financial resources. The question is like, how do we allocate it in a way that everyone benefits? And I think we have this opportunity as young policymakers, as young people in government, to start thinking about that and start building the tools, like participating in fellowships and going out of your way to like apply for things so that you can better like learn from other countries what worked, what didn't. And yeah, I'll just even like close off to even think about something like food insecurity. In some parts of the world, like South Africa, we have a problem with obesity, overnutrition. And then in other parts of the world, we have a problem with malnutrition. And so it just shows that we do have the resources. It's just about like how they get allocated. And I think, yes, in the past, like the previous generation fought for our freedom, like literally our right to vote. Maybe for us, our generational call can be like, now we have these fruits. How do we make sure that everybody benefits from them? How everyone eats from them like equally? And yeah, so I think that is like our real opportunity right now. It's like just shaping the world the way that we see it. Because yeah, we have a lot to offer, and I mean that's why we're here, really.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I could not agree more. And when we look like at our global capacity to feed the world, right, to be able to live in health and well-being and to thrive, as you've said, it's just a question of resources, which we have enough, and how they're distributed, how they are managed. And, your point about the budget, I really take well, because taxes, money in, money out, taxes are themselves a tool. Public policies are tools about how we use the resources that we have and how they benefit our, vision of a just and thriving community. So I think that's so well said. So I want to wrap with the last question that we ask all of our guests on the podcast, which is a very fun question. What are you reading that you'd like to share with our listeners? It can be anything. It can be poetry, it can be academic work, policy, or it can be a novel, nonfiction. But what would you like to share with our listeners? Linda, I'm going to start with you.
Yes, please. And it's very unfortunate that I forgot the book that I was reading. I did not forget. I left it in Kenya because I really tried to pack light for my fellowship. But currently reading The Power of Vision by the late Dr. Miles Monroe. This book really has helped me to discover all the uniqueness and the unique purpose that I am yet to achieve, and just helps me to align with my goals, my visions, my vision in life, and live life according to what I'm meant to be eventually. Yeah.
Beautiful. Thank you for sharing. Sandile, what about you?
So Tidi and I had a joke earlier, and she said, "What are you going to say? Are you going to say Helen Zille's book?" But on a more serious note, I am reading a book. Well, it was gifted to me, and I was told to read it. And every time I open it, so I haven't got it very far, but it's by Songezo Zibi. It's called The Manifesto. And so Songezo, well, I didn't realize this at the time when I was gifted the book, but he's now started his own movement, and I think he's going to contest in the 2024 general elections next year, I think as an independent. I'm not entirely sure. But I think, yeah, his book is sort of like what South Africa can be like. So, yeah.
Excellent. Thank you for sharing. Eunice, how about you?
So fun fact about me, I don't read. I'm kidding. So I'm actually, or I left it also before I came. I was reading a book by Nompumelelo Muingomane. It's titled Everyday Ubuntu, Living Better Together the African Way. I think it wraps it up for me because it speaks to what we've been talking about. But just in addition to that, it's that we are one species, right? So there is no point in battling, in fighting, in the divisions that we have. Two heads are better than one at the end of the day. So let's have that spirit. Let's keep the unity. Let's try and just see what could happen if we actually all work together for once.
Yeah. Amazing. See, this is why I love this question. Chidi, what about you?
So I'm going to cheat a little bit, but I'll be very quick in my descriptions. I'm going to have 2 books. The first book is called The Girl with the Louding Voice by Abi Dare. It is an amazing book. Like, you have to, like, anyone who's listening to this has to, like, you have to go out and get it, because it does reflect on, like, more of a lived experience on like how things like scholarships can change someone's life, because I guess I know it personally, and just seeing it in writing, I was like, wow, that is so moving. It's brilliant. And then the other book I would recommend is The Power of Now by Eckhart Tolle. I think, Oprah Winfrey, all these people have recommended it. And at first I was like, I don't know about this. But then when I actually read it, like, it genuinely changed my life. And I think that it's just important for people in the space, or just in general, like in the world, there's so much like negative news and so much news. It's so overwhelming. It's very important to just check in and introspect as a person and realize that a lot of the answers that we're looking for externally, they're actually within us. And so that's why I recommend that book.
I love that. And I think by reading, looking at art, experiencing knowledge and wisdom from each other, that's one of the things that I love most about this podcast, is having the opportunity to be inspired by you, to hear your wisdom, and to share it with all of our listeners. So thank you, each and every one of you, so much for being on the podcast. Lindah, Sandile, Eunice, and TD.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Ufahamu Africa. You can find more episodes, show notes, and transcripts on our website, ufahamuafrica.com. This podcast is produced and managed by Megan DeMint, with help from production assistants Chukwufunanya Ikechukwu, Alex Kozak, and Ami Tamaklo. We are generously supported by the Carnegie Corporation of New York and receive research assistance from Cornell University and the University of California, Riverside. Our music is courtesy of Kevin McLeod. Until next week, Safiri Salama.